So Western Watersheds Project is a nonprofit organization which is dedicated to protecting and restoring wildlife and watersheds throughout the American West. And so in the wild horse space, we have a very nuanced position, and our nuanced position is we're trying to tell the truth about the role of wild horses in land health issues. And in general, what we find is that wild horses are being scapegoated by the livestock industry. I don't expect everybody in this room to agree with our positioning, and you don't have to. I just want to present our positioning on some of these issues. If it's useful to you, you can adopt some of these ideas, and if it's not useful to you, you don't have to. So anyway, well, let's start out with what we call these animals. And as a legal term of art, Congress has defined wild horses as all unbranded and unclaimed horses and burros on public lands of the United States. That's a legal definition. Congress has decided this is what these creatures are called when they occur within wild horse herd management areas. So that is something that you could kind of stick your foot in the ground and say these should be called wild horses. You're going to be hearing from industry and apologists a lot of use of the word feral. And that, from my standpoint as a biologist, is improper terminology because, although feral comes from the Latin word ferus, which literally is a synonym for wild, the English word it's applied to a wild animals that otherwise, or a wild strain of otherwise domesticated species, or an organism that is reverted to a wild condition except following escape from captivity. And so, and another definition states, existing in a wild or untamed state, having returned to an untamed state from domestication, or suggestive of a wild animal or savage. And so when people use the term feral horses, what they're mistakenly trying, or maybe not mistakenly, but intentionally trying to suggest, is that maybe these were domestic livestock that escaped. And of course, these horses have in many cases been out on the range for many dozens of generations, and they have fully reverted to a wild state. As a behavioral ecologist of ungulates, I can tell you that the behavior of wild horses is nothing like the behavior of domestic horses, which you all are probably well aware of as a lot of you are horse people. And kind of the band structure and the interactions that you have in wild horses don't have any parallels in domestic horses, because principally in domestic horses we geld the stallions, which means they were taking away their testosterone and kind of taming down their behaviors that would otherwise occur in the wild. Then sometimes you see wild horses referred to as livestock, which are by English definition animals kept on a farm, for example cows or sheep, or animals raised for use or pleasure, especially farm animals kept for use or profit. So, if an animal isn't actively being on a farm in a domesticated state or on a ranch in a domesticated state, it is not livestock. Even horses that are released, that are from farms or ranches, but are living out in nature. For instance, on the Anaki herd, there was a gelding that was released by sheep herders, and it was out there with the wild horses. That's not livestock, technically, according to the English definition. And then, are wild horses wildlife? That's something that's a step farther down the road. It's a really interesting question. According to English, animals, birds, insects that are wild and live in a natural environment would seem to qualify. Living things, and especially mammals, birds, and fishes that are neither human nor domesticated. So you could make, based on English etymology, you can make an argument that wild horses are wildlife, although most wildlife biologists, by convention, will not consider them wildlife. And then there's this question of whether wild horses are native to North America. And the big problem with this question is that in science, we don't have a rigorous definition of what it means to be native. And so horses evolved, from in North America for millions of years, literally going back into the Pleistocene or into the Eocene, 58 to 54 million years ago. The first horses evolved on the North American continent. They evolved all the way to the same species that we have today. Equus caballus ferus is how they're calling it these days, the horse. And that species was evolved to Equus lamii during the late Pleistocene, or the Yukon horse. And Baron Ortiz et al. In 2017 did genetic testing on Equus lamii and Equus caballus and found out, lo and behold, they're one and the same thing. And of course, that means that wild horses, the same species that we have out there on the range today, are the same species that were in North America at least as recently as 5,700 years before present. And that's the Murchie et al. Study that you probably heard about on Sunday. You know, of course, we also have to acknowledge that indigenous oral histories say that horses were here all along. And you know, I'm a scientist, and I'm a white scientist, and when I go and hear indigenous people speak about white science, they are careful to impress upon us that white science is not the only way of looking at the world. And we weren't there during this period in question, whether the horses were here or not, between 5,700 years ago and maybe 1544. We weren't here, they were here. So they have oral traditions that have great conservative fidelity over the years, because the way that they hand down their oral traditions is that a person would speak the oral history, and then elders in the room would correct the record if they screwed up. And so they were always being watched, and it's a sort of a peer review that, you know, from generation to generation is passed down in a way that, you know, is completely foreign to us white people. So when we, you know, kind of say something, and then somebody else says it to somebody else, and somebody says it to somebody else, and there's the game of telephone, and then you get around the other side of the room, it's completely different. We don't have that same kind of corrective factor every generation the way that they did. And it was necessary for them to have this because they didn't have writing, right? We have writing. Our writing is flawed. Our writing is biased by whoever's doing the writing. But, you know, it is conservative. Once you write it down, the Venerable Bede's words are still there for us to read. The indigenous peoples had oral histories that were passed down and had a different method of remaining conservative. And it is a mistake, I think, to think that that theirs is has less fidelity than ours. I was at a rest stop in the northern Yukon at one point, and there was a sign up that said, yes, this is a site of a northern Cochoni legend where a warrior fought a giant beaver. Okay, during the Pleistocene, there were 6-foot-tall beavers. If indigenous people can remember through their culture the Pleistocene, what white person can remember anything from the Pleistocene, right? That's pretty amazing. So I have to, you know, tip my cap to that and say, look, we better take some note of this. Anyway, you know, Archaeological Convention states that wild horses went extinct in this interregnum, and then were later reintroduced. So there's a live controversy over whether there was a continuous history of wild horse presence in North America or not. Anybody that says that there wasn't is on really shaky ground. Anybody who says that there was is on somewhat shaky ground, less shaky ground than those that say they weren't, because, you know, in science, the absence of presence does not equate to the presence of absence, right? It just means we might not have discovered it yet. So let's talk about this latest finding that just came out last month, because we're seeing a lot of this online. And there's been a lot of focus on the fact that this latest radiocarbon dating of horses in North America showed that the indigenous people had horses in their camps in a looks like a domesticated state prior to the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, which is widely credited by scientists up to this point as being the origin of wild horses. They already had them. So that's one of the findings. But the other finding that nobody's paying a whole lot of attention to, but everybody in the wild horse universe should be aware of, is this statement: mitochondrial phylogenetic inference also rejected maternal continuity from late Pleistocene horses excavated both north and south of the North American ice sheets. So what that means is they're looking at the mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down from mother to mother in the egg, and determining that there is no link between the 4 horses in this study. Sample size of 4, small sample size, but there's no link between those horses directly and the Pleistocene horses. Instead, what they found was combine these phylogenetic reconstructions portray historic and modern North American horses as mainly descending from domestic bloodlines that started spreading outside their native area of the Don-Volga region no earlier than 4,200 years ago. So basically, they're saying in this study, these 4 horses are traced back to central Russia and not to the North American Equus lambii / Equus caballus that was here during the Pleistocene. So that is not supportive of the narrative that wild horses were here the whole time. But it is not necessarily to disprove it either, because it's a sample size of 4. Okay, there could be other horses that they will find later that show a genetic connection. But I just want everybody to realize that this study says 2 things, right? And it doesn't all support the same narrative. Okay, so as we all are well aware, wild horses are a pawn in the livestock industry's public relations game. And that public relations game has been adopted by the Wildlife Society, by state game management agencies, by hunting groups, and by many conservation groups as well. And we're all dupes here. It's a case of, Madison Avenue marketing. If you repeat the same thing, even if it's completely fictional, 27 times, and somebody hears it 27 times, they will accept that narrative as common knowledge. And that's what's happened with wild horses, is that they have repeated this same narrative. They're a non-native invasive species. They're damaging the range. They're overpopulated. You can see this if you look at any BLM press release. They have strong message fidelity in their press releases, and they repeat it on purpose, and that's the reason. So the first myth is kind of exemplified by this statement by a Wyoming legislature in January of this year. They were pushing a piece of legislation that would allow horse slaughter in Wyoming. And this legislator by the name of John Winter said, "I'll tell you, there are just too many horses. They're affecting sage grouse and other wildlife, and it's ruining the range." And this was all framed in the context of the Red Desert. So when I heard this, I thought, well, we can disprove that. Let's go ahead and take a look. And what I did is I used Western Watersheds Project's HMA domestic grazing database, which is online for anybody. If you just Google up Western Watersheds HMA, it'll come right up. And it'll allow you to click on the individual herd management area and then toggle back and forth and see how many wild horses are there and how many livestock animal unit months are there. And what I was able to determine from this analysis, that in the Red Desert, which is a 6 million acre piece of public land, there are, as of 2022, 2,327 wild horses left. This is post roundups in 2021. And that includes, I went ahead and included White Mountain. And the reason I included White Mountain is it was included in the Red Desert complex of gathers, and also because conveniently, White Mountain HMA and a lot of the northern Red Desert is all part of the Rock Springs grazing allotment, so it made it simpler for me to do the apples to apples comparison. In this Red Desert area, there are 436,837 animal unit months. So that's a cow-calf pair for a month, or a 5 domestic sheep for a month. And that's the equivalent, if you divide by 12, that's how you convert the animal unit months of livestock to wild horse equivalents. That's 36,406 wild horses. So these cattle and sheep are eating as much as you would have 36,000 wild horse eat. And this shows you the difference in weight here. So there's 15.6 times the effect of livestock grazing on the Red Desert's public lands. Now, some of the Red Desert doesn't have wild horses. Some of it does. That's part of the equation too. The livestock are affecting 100% of it. And also, interestingly, according to the Bureau of Land Management, as they were preparing their Red Desert Complex plan amendment, they found that all of the Western Red Desert herd management areas are meeting the thriving natural ecological balance already that are required by the Wild Horse and Burro Act. And indeed, what we do find as Western Watersheds Project, we look at land health, and the land health in the Red Desert is better than it is in many other places. So the Bureau of Land Management, another problem here is that they're equating, when they say overpopulated, what they really mean is above the appropriate management level that they arbitrarily set. And they pull this number out of, how can I say this politely, out of the air. From a scientific perspective, overpopulated means above carrying capacity, but the Bureau of Land Management isn't considering the carrying capacity of ungulates on the land. And if they did, they would probably say, well, you know, most of the carrying capacity is already taken up by livestock, so that doesn't count in carrying capacity. And I actually had Peter Coates, a USGS biologist, basically say the same thing in a presentation that he made about his wild horse sage grouse study, where he said, oh, the livestock grazing is part of the baseline. They're already there. So the wild horses are additive to the impacts of the livestock, which is functionally not true. The wild horses are there year round. The livestock get trucked out every year for the most part. Of course, you're well aware of the National Academies of Sciences 2013 study stating how AMLs are established, monitored, and adjusted is not transparent to stakeholders, supported by scientific information, or amenable to adaptation. Basically, there's no link between AMLs and science. The Bureau of Land Management is just arbitrarily setting these population numbers according to politics, not science. And then under the Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act, excess animals are ones that must be removed from an area in order to preserve and maintain a thriving natural ecological balance and a multiple use relationship in that area. You know, you see all the time cases of wild horse gatherers where they're not connecting the reduction in either AMLs or the gathering of wild horses to a need to reestablish thriving natural ecological balance. In fact, for the most part, after they gather the wild horses, they're still not meeting thriving natural ecological balance because the cows are preventing them from ever meeting that target. And then you have this big myth of, you know, that we're gonna, no thank you. This big myth that we're going to need to round up these wild horses for their own good. It's an act of mercy, and it's for their own best interest. And of course, in the declaration of Michael Gates in June 2021 regarding the Onaki herd, and this is just on the eve of the Onaki roundup, he stated, horses within the Onaki HMA have an overall body condition score of 4, which coupled with poor range condition and lack of forage, puts them at risk for rapid deterioration in body condition as the summer progresses. This will result in suffering and, for some individual animals, death. If the July gather does not proceed as planned, it is likely that BLM employees will need to euthanize the animals as an act of mercy. He put that in a sworn declaration in the case that the Friends of Animals brought against the 10-year plans that BLM had for this area. I did reach out to Friends for Animals saying, gee, maybe we should see if perjury is part of this, because he did it in a sworn declaration. They investigated that, and their attorneys concluded that he had just enough weasel words and just enough reference to the future, which nobody can predict, to get him off the hook legally, and so they didn't pursue that. But at any rate, the Salt Lake Tribune in July, in the middle of the roundup, said, an official also acknowledged most of the horses taken off the range exhibited fairly good body conditions, contrary to earlier reports that many Onaki horses were suffering from a lack of water and forage due to overpopulation and drought. So they got caught in the middle of the roundup. Did they stop the roundup? No, they did not. They just kept on going and said, no, now the reason we're having this roundup is because of drought, no longer because of the body condition of the horses. And then the rest of the story is that last summer at the Healthy Public Lands Conference, Michael D. Gates himself attended and came on our field tour of Onaki, where I was able to call him out and say, you know, here's the range condition, and here's the field manager that said these wild horses are overpopulated. And over here is Brian Maffley, the reporter who exposed it. And then his response to this was, I stand by my statements. So even in the face of getting caught in the lie, Michael Gates stood there baldly and said, I stand by my statements, and I'm not going to recant. Really interesting. It just shows you how deeply entrenched these Bureau of Land Management officials can be. Now, one thing that I want, how did we get here? Okay. One thing I want folks to take a look at is take a look at the sage grouse plan amendment proposed alternative to the BLM has, because one of the key component and management issues they raise is wild horse and burrow management. And this is really interesting because wild horses, when the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service did their warranted but precluded finding in 2010, finding that the sage grouse warranted endangered species protection, they looked at wild horse impacts and said, no, that's not a principal threat. But all of a sudden in this BLM planning process, the wild horse issue is going to be an area of focus. So wild horse advocates probably should be getting involved and engaged in this particular planning process. And under Alternative 3, it states in those PHMAs, priority habitat management areas for sage grouse, with existing herd management areas, wild horses and burrows would be removed. So they're looking at whether they should zero out all the wild horse herd management areas that fall within sage grouse priority habitats. So pay attention. I don't think this is the alternative they're going to choose. Weirdly, this is the alternative that is better for sage grouse in other respects. So they have bundled this together, hoping that they can sucker the conservation community saying, we want Alternative 3, because that's the one that gives us science-based sage grouse protections, and slipped in there is this little thing about wild horses, so pay attention. Also, here's a screenshot of our herd management area database. Most of the wild, if not all of the wild horse herd management areas are also leased for cattle and sheep grazing. And typically the cattle and sheep animal unit months are twice or more the amount of animal unit months that the wild horses take up, okay? So the way that you convert wild horses to animal unit months again is 1 wild horse per month equals 1 animal unit month, which means that 12 wild horse animal unit months equals 1 wild horse out there for 12 months of the year, okay? So it's an easy conversion factor that lets you go back and forth between cattle to wild horses, sheep to wild horses, and make an apples to apples comparison, because the industry will always say, oh, the cattle are only out there for a few months of the year, but the wild horses are out there year round, inferring that their grazing pressure is greater. It's a little bait and switch. Although if the cattle outnumber the wild horses 30-to-1 for those 2 months, then the cattle grazing might be greater. And if you look at the AUMs, you can find out exactly who has the greater grazing pressure. And every single herd management area I've looked at so far, the cattle and sheep grazing far outstrips the wild horse grazing. And I think that's on purpose. And the other thing that you need to know about cattle and sheep grazing allotments is that they typically authorize 50 to 65% forage utilization. And forage utilization is not the amount of forage that's out there when they bring the cattle out. It's the amount of forage that's going to grow for that entire year from January 1st to December 31st. All of the forage production, the cattle are taking off 50 to 65%. And so every species of herbivore that's out there, from wild horses to elk to deer to jackrabbits to mice that's eating that vegetation, has to survive on 35 to 50% of the vegetation that's going to grow that year. And then the grass has to survive. And these are perennial grasslands in the interior basins of the West. And if you lose those perennial grasses, you get cheatgrass coming in and invading, and it's highly flammable, and that's what you have the big invasive weed problem with. And it's all driven by livestock grazing. And then if you look at the wild horse issue and cattle, you know, wild horses are only one of a great variety of species that are being targeted by the livestock industry for extirpation. Their agenda essentially is to convert Western public lands to a domesticated system of pastures and paddocks for their livestock, without any regard to healthy ecosystems, without any regard to other species. They want everything to revolve around them and their needs. So they have poisoning campaigns for prairie dogs, and they're actively out there with different kinds of poisons that are, you know, poisoning this rodent, which is a keystone species in grasslands and deserts for species like hawks and eagles, for species like swift foxes that are their predators. I had one conservation colleague say, prairie dogs are the frozen burrito of the plains. Everybody eats them. And domestic sheep threaten bighorn sheep survival because they're carrying diseases like mycoplasma and manhymia which are diseases that give pneumonia to bighorn sheep, but are pretty harmless for domestic sheep. And once the bighorns catch these diseases, it can wipe out entire herds from one nose-to-nose contact. And it's so severe that game and fish agencies, if they have a bighorn sheep that has Pasteurella, and they document this, they will go in and they will wipe out the entire bighorn sheep herd, terrified that this infected sheep will then go around and infect other herds of bighorn sheep. So this is a really big problem too. Ranchers obviously are targeting grizzly bears for extirpation. The Upper Green River Grazing Project in western Wyoming, this is something where we had oral arguments before the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals last month, authorizes 72 grizzly bears to be killed in a 10-year period. 72 grizzly bears out of what, maybe 400 in the entire population in Yellowstone. They're going to kill 72 of them in these 6 allotments over a 10-year period. This is a species that's listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, and yet the Fish and Wildlife Service is allowing these kinds of depredation killings because the livestock industry wants it. And in the Montana legislature right now, there's a bill that's led by ranchers that would give ranchers basically an unlimited license to kill. Here's your tag. You can take a grizzly bear if you see it and it's threatening your livestock. Well, what exactly does threatening mean? You know, any rancher that sees a grizzly bear is going to say that grizzly bear, because I saw it, is by definition threatening my livestock. And this is, again, a threatened species under the ESA. And of course, wolves. Good grief. You know, where it began, the Colorado wolf reintroduction is currently being fought tooth and nail by the livestock industry. They had a whole coalition they called the Stop the Wolf Coalition that they ran when there was that ballot initiative in Colorado to bring wolves back, and they lost the election, which is a big slap in the face because the ranchers like to believe that they speak for the West. But they lost that election, and now they're fighting in the legislature to delay the reintroduction of wolves. They're pushing for hunting from airplanes, from hunting with night vision scopes, expanding wolf killing in all kinds of ways, because fundamentally they want to drive wolves extinct. They want to get rid of them. Same as wild horses. So you folks are not alone out there and being victimized by the livestock industry. There are lots of other species. And one of the things that wild horse advocates can do when they're talking to conservationists is say, hey, look, just like all these other species, this is, these wild horses are the victims of the machinations of the livestock industry, and we should be joining forces to fight their depredations. And mountain lions, of course, are targeted for killing too, and both wolves and mountain lions are potential predators for wild horses and would have some degree of natural population limitation. So last year, USDA Wildlife Services killed 205 mountain lions. This is the U.S. Department of Agriculture on behalf of the ranchers. And then the state of Utah just recently adopted an amendment to move the mountain lion from a trophy species, which is managed by the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources, to allow them to be shot year-round as basically a vermin and have uncontrolled killing, which is the opposite of wildlife management. And then, of course, coyotes as well are being targeted for extermination. And last year, Wildlife Services killed 56,000 of them. And all for ranchers. And for what? You know, I mean, every now and again, a coyote takes a calf. Coyote do take domestic sheep, but not very many. A pretty small number. And basically, the livestock industry would like to wipe them out. And happily for coyote populations, they have a very high rate of intrinsic increase. So the more you kill them, the faster they breed, and the more coyotes you get. So they're not in danger of extinction. The bad news, if you're an individual coyote, is you're being trapped and poisoned and otherwise targeted for death. And then, of course, livestock are also competing directly with not just wild horses, but every other species of herbivore that's out there. So one cow-calf pair eats as much forage as 2 elk, or 6 mule deer, or 10 pronghorn. And so every cow-calf pair you see out on the range means, less of these animals. And this is an analysis that came out of, by the way, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Conservation Service. These are their statistics. Importantly for wild horse folks, in the Wild Horse and Burro Act, range means the amount of land necessary to sustain an existing herd or herds of wild free-roaming horses in burrows which does not exceed their known territorial limits as of 1971, and which is devoted principally but not necessarily exclusively to their welfare, in keeping with the multiple use management concept of public lands. So if these herd management areas are developed principally but not necessarily exclusive to wild horses' welfare, why are we putting cattle out there? That's a really interesting question. And if wild horses are overpopulated and the range is suffering, isn't the first thing that they ought to do to pull these animals off the range? Now, the cattle ranchers pay $1.35 per animal unit month to graze on federal public lands. On private lands, the amount is $23.60 as of 2017. I was just at a conference arranged by the livestock industry where they represented, where the livestock raiser that I visited on the tour says, yes, I graze exclusively on private lands and I'm charged $25 an animal unit a month. This was in Steamboat, Colorado. When wild horses are removed from these lands that are worth $1.35 an animal unit a month to the livestock industry, they're put on private lands, mostly in eastern Kansas and eastern Oklahoma, and we, the taxpayers, pay what the BLM represents as $60 an animal unit a month. So we're taking horses off of land that has very little value for grazing, putting them on really high value lands, getting charged a premium to do that, just so that the cattle industry can have animal unit months at $1.35, which is just a bargain basement price. And the ecological tragedy here is that this is displacing cattle from wet areas in eastern Kansas and eastern Oklahoma, where cattle do well and they're ecologically suitable, to put them in areas of the arid west where they do tremendous ecological damage. And what do we get for this? Because the livestock industry likes to puff itself up and say, we are the pillars of the community economically. And helpfully, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association last year commissioned a study by the University of Wyoming to say how much money public lands livestock grazing in 3 different states, Wyoming, Idaho, and Oregon, contributes to the local economy. And they didn't just count public lands livestock ranches, they also counted the effect, the knock-on effect on associated businesses, feed stores, hardware stores, things like that in town. And what they calculated was in Wyoming, the livestock industry is worth $213 million. That sounds like a lot of money, right? The gross domestic product of Wyoming is $41.5 billion. And it's an economic pipsqueak. And so public lands livestock grazing comprises 1/2% of the economy in the cowboy state. If it all went away tomorrow, nobody would notice in Wyoming. In Idaho, it's even worse. It's 0.2% of the Idaho economy. It's 0.05% of the Oregon economy. Thank you, National Cattlemen's Beef Association, for putting some actual financial numbers to your assertion that public lands ranching is economically significant, because you just showed that you are economically irrelevant. And also, public lands livestock grazing in the western states contributes very little to the national beef supply as well. And only 1.6% of American cattle graze on public lands. And I talked with Kaufman et al., and the way that he calculated this was he calculated animal unit months on public lands compared to animal unit months of beef only everywhere else. He didn't, I don't think, count dairy cows. And so it's an underestimate on his part. It's conservative because dairy cows, once they're done being milked, go into the beef supply and they become hamburgers. That's part of your beef chain. But I don't think that was counted. And so these are Kaufman's numbers that aren't in his publication, so take a screenshot if you need. I asked him how he got that 1.6% number, and it's rigorous. And then at the end of the day, the solution is, let's get the cattle and sheep off the herd management areas. And the federal regulations already have a provision that authorizes the Bureau of Land Management to close herd management areas to all or a particular class of livestock, either temporarily or permanently. It's already in the federal regulations. They have the discretion to do that. They just never choose to do it. They should start. In 2021, Western Watersheds Project drafted up a letter. It was signed probably by many of you. It was signed by 70 wild horse and conservation groups, went into Deb Haaland saying, get the cattle and sheep out of the wild horse herd management areas, both the current and former, and the Sierra Club followed suit in September. So there's plenty of folks that have said, let's do this. It's time for them to actually get it underway. Another issue that's out there that needs to be done, in our view, in terms of wild horse issues, is to restore the natural predators, the wolves and the mountain lions. And there are a couple of really good peer-reviewed scientific publications that are showing that mountain lions have a significant effect predating upon wild horses, not just on foals, but on adults as well. And some of these cats are specializing in wild horses to the exclusion of deer, which you'd think would be an easier species for them to take. So these are the citations for these two studies, Andreasen et al. 2021 and Greger and Romney 2001. And of course, we don't have wolves out in the areas that have wild horses yet in this country. They've got them in Canada. You would expect that mountain lions would be good predators in wooded areas because they are ambush predators, not very effective out in the open sagebrush. Wolves are coursing predators, in other words, running their prey, and so they would be more effective out in the open basins. We need to bring these animals back. About half of the 1971 wild horse herd management areas that were existing in 1971 have already been zeroed out. This is our little analysis of just Bureau of Land Management lands. Of course, there's the reference in the Wild Horse and Burro Act that says that it's that they should be protected from capture, branding, harassment, or death. And to accomplish this, they are to be considered in the area where presently found as an integral part of the natural system of the public lands. Something got lost along the way, because even today, the Bureau of Land Management is trying to zero out herd management areas. The Red Desert has several of these HMAs that are slated for zeroing out under the plan amendments. And this happens under the RMP plan amendments, folks. If you are not involved in your RMP plan amendments, get involved, because one of the things we learned in the Cali, we challenged, along with AWHC, we challenged the Caliente gather in southeastern Nevada. They made the decision in 2018. We filed lawsuit immediately. We got kicked out of court because our lawsuit wasn't timely filed. The Bureau of Land Management cooked up this argument that said, hey, we zeroed out the wild horse herds in the resource management plan in 2009. And so that statute of limitations of 6 years has already expired. They've lost their chance, Your Honor, and they shouldn't be here in court trying to stop this roundup that we just authorized, because they've sat on their rights. And the courts went along with it. So pay attention to the plan amendments, pay attention to the resource management plan revisions. Another thing that I want folks to pay attention to is minimum viable population sizes. The minimum viable population size, according to the latest science, and that's Frankum in 2014, is not 50 for genetic viability and 500 for ecological viability anymore. It's now 100 effective population size for genetic viability and 1,000 for ecological viability. What that means is that you need to have 100, the equivalent of 100 males and 100 females that are actively breeding with an even sex ratio. And wild horses are harem breeders, so you have one stallion and multiple mares. That's an uneven sex ratio. So there's an equation that has to be performed to see, what is your effective number if you have, say, 100 wild horses. And helpfully, Singer et al. In 2000 performed this effective number calculation for you all in their study on the prior mountain wild horse herd, finding that the correction factor to get an N sub E, or effective number, for wild horses is 0.36. So when you back calculate that to see how many does it take, how many wild horses does it take to get a minimum viable population of 100, it takes 278 animals. That's a bigger number than Gus Cothran is stating. Gus Cothran is not up to date. 278 is the number. Now, if you have herd management areas that are right next to each other and they can have some interbreeding, then you should probably be combining those populations that are adjacent to each other, because it doesn't take much immigration and emigration to maintain genetic viability. But a lot of these wild horse populations are isolated. So if you have a wild horse population and it's isolated and the appropriate management level is less than 278, you are not maintaining genetic viability for that herd. Is that a legal problem? I think it might be. I think folks should probably be pursuing that. And this number, by the way, this calculation under Springer et al. Assumes many small harems. It would be an even larger number if you had a few larger harems. You would need 370 wild horses in that context to maintain genetic viability. If you don't have genetic viability, you get inbreeding depression, which means lower reproductive rates. It's a spiral to extinction. You have birth defects. It's bad news. So, I think it's fair to expect the Bureau of Land Management to maintain viable populations of wild horses in areas that they manage for them. And that's my presentation. And I've left a little bit of time here for questions at the front. Happy to take it.
The IU